Welcome everyone to our session, our high-level panel on a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to reform farm subsidies at the World Trade Organization. And it's quite a strange time for us to be meeting with the 12th Ministerial Conference having been postponed late last week. But I think it's really important that we still have this discussion, because I think this is a discussion that goes way beyond the WTO. And I think some of the solutions or answers that can be found to how we reform farm subsidies can maybe happen outside the WTO before we bring it back in. So even though we're not meeting alongside the ministerial conference, I hope that this discussion will help further our debates for how we can reform farm subsidies. As many of you know, the WTO has been trying, or WTO member states have been trying unsuccessfully for the past 2 decades to reform agricultural subsidies. And whilst the problem hasn't gone away, there's a question about whether the WTO can be the place where countries can find common ground to this problem. And the reason we're organizing this panel today is because we feel the issue of agricultural subsidies has become hot again. And it was very much thanks to a new UN report that was co-authored by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNEP, and the UNDP, calling on governments to repurpose up to $540 billion worth of agricultural support away from products that are harmful to human health and the planet, and towards support that would help us transition to new food systems that can provide affordable, nutritious food to all in an environmentally sustainable way. This UN report that came out just recently has been backed by a number of other reports by the World Bank, by the OECD, by the International Food Policy Research Institute, all on this same issue of how we can repurpose the agricultural support that we are currently spending. And this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm really thrilled that we have 2 of the authors of this UN report with us, Valentina Pernicelle from the FAO and David Laborde from the International Food Policy Research Institute. And we also have 2 people with us who I think have dedicated their lives to fighting for a radical rethink and a radical change to the trade regime that governs agricultural support to producers. And that is Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and Sophia Murphy, the Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, or IATP. This is a joint panel. It's IISD, my organization, together with IFPRI and IATP. So I'm pleased to be co-organizing this event with them. We'll move straight to speakers and straight to presentations. We'll start with a presentation of the report. Please feel free to use the chat box, put your questions, put your comments, tell us how you feel. And given that this is in a meeting format, I will also, after our speakers have given their first inputs, allow people to raise their hand, unmute themselves and ask questions. So please feel free either to put your comments in the chat and your questions or to raise your hands. So without further ado, I'd like to start with one of the main authors of this report, Valentina Pernicelle from the FAO, to give us some news about what the report says and what the recommendations were. Valentina, over to you.
Thank you, Karin. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and also thanks to IISD for inviting me today to participate into this conversation. I think it's very positive to keep up the momentum on the agricultural policy and repurposing agenda post Food System Summit and COP26 and ahead of the WTO Ministerial Conference whenever this will take place. So as you rightly said, as a lead author of the publication, I'm presenting some of the key findings of the FAO UNDP UNEP report, a multi-billion-dollar opportunity to set the stage of the debate. I've asked myself why the topic has gained so wide appeal recently. And I think it's not only because of the food system narrative and the burning climate change issues, but also because we are still trying and struggling to answer some very challenging and sometimes frustrating questions. Like, how is it possible that helping and protecting farmers who feed us becomes an obstacle for agri-food system development? Why certain policies that are in principle supposed to be supportive in their nature and positive in their objectives end up hurting food security, environment, and human health? So I think these are the core questions that motivated the debate and motivated the analysis that we have been doing over the past months. And we are not alone in this. I mean, OECD, the World Bank, IISD itself, I mean, they have been engaging a lot around the topic. So with this small introduction, I want to start with the slide that appear on the screen, just to schematic overview, just to understand that agricultural policies may be of different type. They can be trade measure, border measure, price intervention, subsidies, payments to farmers, investment in public goods or regulation around land, for example. But whatever form they take, they impact and shape production, decisions, practices, and behaviors, as well as trade dynamics in food systems. So given this enormous power that they have, if they are not properly designed, implemented, or adjusted when needed, they can easily become harmful. And there is already a body of evidence that confirms that measures affecting prices or subsidies linked to production criteria are to different extents dangerous and problematic. Border measures like tariffs or quota or fixed domestic prices that keep producer price above the market level can distort trade and generate suboptimal production and consumption decisions. Similarly, subsidies on inputs or output, for example, can promote the overuse of natural resources or foster monoculture or even affect nutritional outcomes by boosting, for example, production availability and therefore consumption of cereals versus fruit and vegetables. Fiscal subsidies are also problematic because they drain public resources that could instead be invested in areas where returns of investment are higher and benefits are more long-lasting, let's say. So we go to the next slide, please. And we take a look at how agricultural support looks around the world. Most of the support to agriculture targets farmers individually. So on average, in the last period for which data is available within the Ag Incentives Consortium, support to farmers accounted for $540 billion yearly in net terms. We can see from the yellow bar that more than half of this amount is provided to farmers in form of price incentives or price support that basically emanates from border measures or domestic price interventions, while the rest are subsidies, fiscal subsidies, of which about 70% are defined as coupled to production. All in all, this means that the vast majority of agricultural support comprises policies that are potentially harmful. And the situation appears even more critical knowing that the commodities targeted by those policies are the most emission intensive, such as beef, milk and rice, or those with less nutritional value, like sugar, for example. How countries support agriculture, of course, varies a lot according to their policy objectives or the income status of the country. I mean, we see from the right-hand graph It shows that price incentive and fiscal subsidies tied to production have been the most widely used instruments in high-income countries, but there's a declining trend. These measures are becoming increasingly popular across some middle-income economies, while on the other end, in most low-income countries, farmers receive very few subsidies and are also implicitly penalized, and even more so in the past, by policies that tend to keep food prices low to the benefit of the consumers. Next slide. So that this picture at end, we have done some simulations in the report. First, we projected the level of support to 2030 under a sort of support as usual scenario, let's say. And this simulation tell us that basically farm support would reach almost 1.8 trillion US dollars in less than 10-year times. We have then simulated the extreme case of a complete removal of all farm support measures to understand what would be the hypothetical effects. And the results indicate, and these are shown in the graph here, that greenhouse gas emissions will reduce, driven mainly by cropland and especially pasture land reduction, whereas forest habitat and other land habitat are projected to increase. So this is a nice story in principle, but we need to note there are some other effects, as the overall reduction in emission at global scale will not come without trade-offs. So here in this next slide, yeah, thank you, we see that with all support dismantled by 2030, global crop production will fall by 1.3% and livestock by just 0.2%, with rising prices in most of the scenarios by almost 2% in total. So, and also this production contraction, let's say, is mostly determined by the elimination of fiscal subsidies. With agricultural production falling, it's not surprising that less land and other natural resources are used, and therefore that emission will decline. But removing all support would also hurt farmers' income overall. Although this negative effect, I mean, we have to admit that it is much stronger in more developed countries. We move to the next slide.
Valentina, two more minutes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so I need to speed up. Here we see the effects of removing supports on food consumption that will be quite diversified. So removing border measures, left-hand graph, could lead to higher per capita production of many food items, such as sugar, which tends to be highly protected, while consumption of fruits and vegetables may increase, but only in more developed economy, while consumption in non-BRICS developing countries remain largely unaffected. And then the full removal of fiscal subsidies without compensation to farmers will have a spread negative effect on farm income that could lower per capita food consumption of almost all products considered here. So removing farm support and subsidies will come with trade-offs, definitely, on the various food system outcomes. But keeping things as usual is not an option either. What is important is to rethink the way we support farm production. In the report, we proposed a 6-step approach to do so, which is, it is summarized and schematized in the next slide. We can walk through it. I can walk you through it very quickly. So the key steps identified to embark in an effective repurposing strategies are estimate support already provided to farmers and assess how it impacts agriculture and food system, step 1 to 2, formulate an approach, identify and design new policies, assess them ex ante and refine their implementation, step 3 to 5 in the diagram. And finally, step 6, which is about monitoring and evaluating the repurposing strategy after implementation. If we do a click, we should see also that there's no need to say click to the presentation, please. So it appears the second, sorry, there was an animation. There is, I mean, it's clear that this is a politically sensitive path that will certainly face resistance, institutional gaps and bureaucracy. and therefore it can work only through an inclusive stakeholder engagement, transparency, and good communication, and only if tailored to the local socio-economic context where it happens. We can dig, if I have 1 extra minute, we can dig a bit more on step 3, moving to the next slide to look a bit more closely. Can I?
You need to wrap up a little.
Okay. So
we can maybe come back to it a bit more if we get more questions.
These are very conclusive slides that we can, we can discuss them later on. So just some final consideration that can trigger a bit the debate on the next slide, please. The 3 things that I would like to highlight among the many findings and issues emerging from the analysis are that basically it's clear that there is a need to shift away from bad policies more than ever. And I think the pandemic set off another alarm bell around this. But it's important to be aware that removing or drastically reducing harmful support will not solve all the problems. It may actually bring in some other critical side effects, particularly in certain countries or regions of the world. And here comes my second point about the importance of tailoring evidence and recommendation to the country context and specificities. We have presented results of a global study here. Definitely effects of our actions cannot be seen in isolation, but the paradigm shift that we need should happen at country level in premise, because it's there where bad or good policies are designed and effects are felt more clearly. And lastly, I also want to stress a point that repurposing must be definitely a forward-looking exercise, but it cannot dismiss the immediate effects of the reforms that it implies, especially the most negative one that could affect poor and marginalized people even more. So with that, I thank you. We can maybe come back later during the discussion on some of these points.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Valentina. A huge problem ahead of us, a huge amount of support that's likely to grow exponentially in the coming decade, but some ideas for how to solve this problem and for what to focus on. So thank you for giving us those 6-step approaches. Michael, I want to turn straight away to you to see what you think of this report. What do you think of some of the recommendations? What do you think we need to do? Valentina really focused on this has all got to be at the country level, country specific. What about the global level? What about the regional level? Like, how do we solve this problem, not just nationally, but also regionally and globally? Over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everyone for being here. And a big thank you to the authors of the report. This UN report reflects a growing idea in trade policy. The idea is that governments should not eliminate farm support, but should instead repurpose that support through reforms. The report, I think, correctly explains what is needed. Nothing less than, I'm going to quote here, a concerted effort by WTO members to update agricultural trade rules and commitments and make them more conducive to sustainable food systems transformation. This is a significant position taken against previous trends. In general terms, since at least 1982, trade negotiations have focused on limiting the scope of domestic support as much as possible. I agree with the report's call to instead focus on repurposing government support of agriculture as part of an urgent effort to transform our food systems. In this way, this report is a breath of fresh air. However, I do think the report might be limited in some significant ways that would need to be addressed before we move forward. One limitation is that it heavily relies on the concept of trade distortion, and I'll explain why this language of distortion might be limiting. I'll then explain why we are at an impasse on the issue of agriculture at the WTO, and this has to do with the concept of development that is informing WTO negotiations. And finally, I'll provide my sense of a way forward. So first on this concept of trade distortion. The idea of trade distortion is to measure policies against an idealized understanding of a market. And one of those idealizations is a market without government intervention. The problem with this framework is that it measures real policies against a theory, an assumption. What we need we always need government action to ensure that markets are fair and stable. There's no such thing as a market without government action, support, or intervention. Multilateral trade agreements are one way that governments establish the rules of what are necessary preconditions for a fair and stable market, and what counts then as government measures that disrupt markets. Or in other terms, through trade law, governments negotiate what counts as a good subsidy and what counts as a bad subsidy. And these ideas change over time. For example, there is a long-standing debate for the last 120 years over whether countervailing duties are necessary to counteract unwanted subsidies, or whether countervailing duties in and of themselves might cause market instability. In many ways, the current WTO agreement on agriculture reflects the consensus on these issues from the 1980s. So in light of climate change, the 2008 food crisis, and the current food crisis caused by COVID, there is clearly a need to renegotiate what counts as a good subsidy and what is a bad subsidy. There is no longer a multilateral consensus on what constitutes a normal market. So what would happen if we stop using the language of distortion is it would open up the conversation to a wider range of possible ideas, and not just a wider range of policy ideas, but a wider range of possible political solutions, possible institutional designs, and possible legal architecture. I'll turn now to the theory of development that's been informing WTO negotiations. The question of food and agriculture has been contentious since the inception of the WTO. All this recent talk of crisis at the WTO misses the fact that the WTO was born into a crisis when it comes to agriculture. The WTO agreement on agriculture is a key element of international food policy and was part of a wider deal that created the WTO. Before the Uruguay rounds in 1986, the global understanding was that eventually developed countries would reduce their subsidies and allow food and agricultural products to enter in from what were former colonies. In return, developing countries opened up their agricultural markets and agreed to TRIPS. TRIPS, in effect, extended intellectual property rights for global North companies looking to make a profit in the global South. In the midst of the pandemic, I don't have to go through why TRIPS is problematic. We're living the limits of TRIPS today. Nevertheless, that bargain never materialized. In practice, the agreement on agriculture has mostly supported markets with heavily subsidized industrial agricultural sectors and significant import rates like the US and EU. But the problem is not only the hypocrisy of the US and the EU. Another problem is that the development framework informing WTO agricultural negotiations is outdated. The idea that developing countries should gear their agricultural sector towards exporting primary commodities and that their political focus should be on gaining market access to rich countries can be traced back to in some circles is famous, the 1958 Haberler Report. My German is atrocious, so I apologize for my pronunciation. The 1958 Haberler Report reflected the position of some influential economists of the time. What they were concerned about were the problems facing third world countries, combined with the growing trend of state planning. They were worried that this would lead to a Keynesian revolution in the post-colonial world. In view of these particular economists, the post-colonial state was a threat. It was because they were worried it would become, post-colonial states, newly independent countries, would become vehicles for land reform, redistribution, industrialization, and economic growth. The vision of development through trade liberalization was presented in the Haberler Report was a conscious opposition to post-colonial states committed to labor rights, redistribution, education, and land reform. So if our focus today is on transforming food systems, such an outdated development framework will not do. So now here I'll turn in my remaining time to how to move ahead. When we talk about transforming food systems, this will have to include institutional changes. And I want to invite people to start thinking in newer ways, allowing for new solutions to arise. I provide more details in 2 of my UN reports that were to the General Assembly, but let me just put some starting points for our conversation today. I think governments can focus their multilateral energy on developing international food agreements. These would be a series of plurilateral agreements that all fall under the umbrella of GATT, not the Agreement on Agriculture. I've called for the winding down of the Agreement on Agriculture. However, the GATT imagined the world as interconnected domestic markets. The WTO Agreement on Agriculture set out to construct a single global market. International food agreements would be more nuanced. It would take this idea of territorial markets. Now, if I may turn for a moment to the Committee on World Food Security, the CFS. In 2016, the CFS put out policy recommendations on connecting smallholders to markets. These policy recommendations were groundbreaking in that they were a significant first step to better understand and develop the role of markets in food systems in a way that focused on people and not economic growth. Civil society organizations have further refined some of these concepts, and they introduced this notion of territorial markets to capture a deeper understanding of local, national, and transboundary regional markets. Thinking of the world in terms of territorial markets gives a clear understanding of how most people actually buy, sell, and share their food. The term territorial allows people to overcome the limitations of thinking only in terms of global versus local. Territorial markets can be local, national, transboundary, they can be rural, peri-urban, urban. And in my reports, I draw a clear institutional map on how this is all achievable through existing GATT architecture. And I'll plunk that into the chat after I'm done.
Thanks, Michael. 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so international food agreements would be an opportunity to be more deliberate about supporting and constituting territorial markets. The scope of international food agreements would have to be clarified. Using some existing examples, they could be focused on keystone species to take an idea from ecological thinking, or on food staples to draw from the old commodity agreements. They could also be made up by an alliance of communities around the world committed to shared principles or shared biomes in terms of agroecological approaches. Alternatively, territories could be formed around procurement programs. Most importantly, since all ecosystems are interconnected, the ultimate challenge is having an institutional process in place to manage international food agreements so that all the world's territories enhance biodiversity and fulfill everyone's right to food. The ultimate challenge would be to translate human rights processes and principles into a trade negotiation plan. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Wow, that's given us a huge amount of food for thought. And I hope that David and Sophia, when you speak, you also address some of Michael's points. Just a few little summaries just to help steer our direction. A real welcoming of this report, instead of focusing on the elimination of all support, about the repurposing, but limitations to the report and limitations to, I guess, the body of research that's been around this repurposing ag subsidies, which is still measuring good or bad by how much it distorts trade. And whether we need to be beyond this, how do we measure what's good or bad by moving beyond this notion of trade distortion? One of the points you raised that stuck with me is, let's stop using the language of distortion to open the way for a wider range of policy ideas, political institutions, and legal architectures. And that's exactly what I think we want to be talking about today. What do those things look like? What do those new ideas look like? And then thank you for coming up with a really concrete idea of, you know, scrapping what we currently have and thinking about setting up a series of plurilateral agreements at the WTO, or what you're saying is under GATT. I mean, this is interesting, and maybe David and Sophia can talk about it, but what we have seen since the Doha agenda has declined is this emergence of a series of plurilateral agreements at the WTO, and it's been very problematic for a lot of developing country negotiators who haven't been able to follow a whole wide number of plurilateral agreements that are being currently negotiated at the WTO. So it would be good to hear from David and Sophia, and Valentina, we can also come back to you on how we deal with this move to a plurilateral agreements world, if that's what people think should happen. So I'm now going to move to David. David's also one of the authors of this report and of many other reports on repurposing subsidies. And he's going to make the case for using this repurposing agenda at the WTO. And this idea of like, does the WTO have a role to play of do no harm or do good? So David, over to you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. I may react to some of the elements raised by Michael and Valentina, if I can call them by their first name. In some case, I will strengthen the message. In some case, I will have a different point of view. Because I think that when I will try to summarize some of the research we have done over the last few years on this, actually there is at one point some political decision to be made about where we want to go. And it's not so much about research at some stage. So very quickly, I will cover 3 points. What do we want and why do we want to repurpose, some of the key findings and some guidance in the context of the WTO, because I think that's really the key challenge, how much we want the WTO to participate to this overall dynamics, or how it has to be done even at a broader perspective, because it involves so many dimensions that the trade is just one of them, and so maybe not the most important of them. So why do trade rules actually matter for farm policies? I think we know how WTO contribute to shaping them with, of course, what's happened on market access and therefore the level of prices, what's happened in terms of domestic support. Export subsidies have been tackled by developed economies, and I think that's also one of the achievements of the last decade from some of the ministerials. But so low-income countries and middle-income countries still use export subsidies, and in some cases that hurt them. That I think we have to keep this in mind. Sometimes we think that more policy space is good. In many examples today, policy space means countries implementing policy that hurt sometimes the voiceless in their countries, because any policy is a result of a political game, and power relations within and across countries shape them. So policy space and disciplines is also here to protect sometimes the weak and the voiceless, both internationally and domestically, and we should not neglect it. This policy, of course, impacts what we produce, how much we produce, where it comes from, and how it is produced. And these have changed over time, meaning the technology we have today are different from 20 years ago. Who has access to this technology change? The taste of consumers have evolved, but also, where the food comes from today, and potentially different with what I said before, the developing countries have taken control of most of the world food markets nowadays. In most of the key commodities, if you look at the top 5, you will see Brazil, Argentina, India. That was not the situation 20 years ago. And I think something we have to be very careful is developing country doesn't mean a lot today. It's a spectrum, very rich, very complex. And you have people that, including in the developing world, that had the opportunity, the financial access, the technology to take opportunities on the markets, sometimes also with strong domestic policy to support them. And you have other countries and other farmers that didn't have these opportunities. But the regime has delivered to some extent on some elements, not all of them, but on some of them. But not everyone is in a better situation today than 30 years ago for sure, but many people are. And any repurposing will have cross-border impact, will impact trade flows, but also will impact, the global public good we have, like greenhouse gas emission, and we all benefit or we all suffer from it as soon as one country is starting to mess up with the carbon balance of the world. Now, clarification, and I think that Valentina has already touched about it. Transparency is important. Monitoring of these policies is important. We first need people to agree on the numbers. today, thanks to some initiative like the Ag Incentive Consortium, where many IOs, insurance organizations are part of, progress have been made. But sometimes we still, for example, between the WTO and I would say other institutions that much more focusing on the policy impact of choices, different way to measure things. And the big one is price support. And I will come back to this because that's a major issue, but what are we talking exactly about? We have a discipline that is based on a notion of price support that is different from what most operators in the business community or most economists would like to see when we want to say, okay, this is really the price difference we see. Now, repurposing obviously is not canceling the old policy agenda. I think we have to be careful about that. Some farmers still need support. Delivering food to people is still there. Some countries will still believe in self-sufficiency. Other countries will still believe in a more integrated market. Repurposing is more to say, okay, basically production and trade are not just the two elements that we should focus on. There is environmental impact, there is social impact, there is health impact, and we want to think about it when we design and implement these policies. But adding more things may also trigger the spending of more money. And actually more money is going to be more problem because once again, political economy is going to kick in. People are going to use this argument, oh, we need to have greener technology just to grasp more money. And when you give money to farmers, it's very difficult to get it back, even after they have adopted the green technology. So I think, you know, the process is important, institution is important, transparency is important. And of course, repurposing are going to take place across different products, potentially different policy instruments, different WTO box as of today, but also there's a question of countries. Because 2/3 of the countries in the world today are not spending money on their agriculture. So what is the discussion about repurposing for them? It's just starting to have the right practices, potentially learning from the past. Key findings. So here very briefly, I think that the UN report has been a key milestone, but this is a work we have also started a few years ago with the World Bank, that also during the Food System Summit, there is interesting question and issue raised there. To be very brief, what at IFPRI we have done with the World Bank already in 2020 was to understand what is the current effect of today's policies on emission, what's happened if we start to focus more on public good like infrastructure and R&D. In the 21 report with the UN, you have a very important discussion about beyond, you know, emission, what it means for nature, nutrition, health, and with what is very important, a breakdown by different type of policies, because different type of policies in different places of the world has different impact. And in the Food System Summit, we also have a look about what's happened if you start to say, oh, there is some good product and we want to move the money from bad product to good product. But it's not so easy to define what is a good or bad product in itself. There's a lot of context-specific aspect of it, and on different dimensions. You know, a good product for nutrition is not synonymous from a good product from climate change sometimes, especially for countries that need more nutritive food, and where the main source of nutritive food is actually animal product. So what we have learned in this exercise, removing existing policies are going to hurt farmers, is going to globally help the poor, especially if we remove protection, basically if we remove and basically bring down the cost of food, because when you remove subsidies, you basically push the price of food up. When you remove tariffs, you put the price of food down. And really, you know, this balance is critical for poor people because, of course, we have really poor farmers, really poor smallholders, but some of them are still net food importers. And you have also a lot of poor people in urban areas. So understanding this complexity and the interaction between instruments is important. And globally, yes, as Valentina has shown, we save emission, but we save a bit of emission. We are talking about 1 or 2% of the agricultural footprint. So we are not talking about a revolution here. And obviously the subsidies of today are not killing the planet, you know. The fact that maybe we are eating too much meat in rich countries, it's a problem. The fact that we are subsidizing the livestock industry in rich countries is a minor aspect of the story. Still, it's important to take into account, but we should not create incredible expectation about, oh, we repurpose the money, problem solved, and we can move on to a happy future. No, there is a lot of things to do on different aspects to get there. So That's why we should not talk about removing, but repurposing. And that, I think, where is the key challenge. Obviously, if we want to deliver on climate change, we need to move to a sustainable intensification. And this has cost for farmers and potentially, especially for small farmers. And so there is a space here for policy.
2 minutes, David.
Perfect. Border policy and domestic support. There is here, as we said, a very complex interaction. But the fact that today you have a lot of countries that are highly protectionist on sugar is not a big problem in terms of health. It's more good thing. Now, the fact that some of these countries are also protectionist in milk, when at the same time they have really in their population deficiency in terms of calcium, in terms of other nutrients, it's a problem. So how we balance this is once again important. And input subsidies can be even a trickier aspect because fertilizer subsidies, yes, we use more fertilizer, but with higher yield, you use less land. So actually you can protect some forest. And if you are in some specific developing countries where smallholder doesn't really have access to credit or to financial means to buy the fertilizer in advance, a fertilizer subsidy is still a default option that makes sense for policymakers. So, context both in terms of impact and what is available for people is important. Now, focusing on, as I said, healthy and environmental product, the problem is how you pick winners. And we have to be extremely careful that, sometimes meat is not just bad. It depends who is eating it and why, who is producing it, and how you produce it. And also, we not should oversimplify this complex issue. So, but here there is actually some space to reduce the cost of healthy diets by some smarter spending. But my key caveat here will be, we focus here a lot on producer level instruments. When providing better nutrition, especially for the most vulnerable people in your country, it's first of all a social safety net problem. It's redistribution. It's school feeding program. It's not trying to make carrots more affordable for everyone. It's to make carrot affordable for people that doesn't have the income means to buy them. And so, what type of policy you want and how we think about consumer-oriented measure versus producer-oriented measure is key. So now, what it means for trade rules. On one hand, today you can do a lot of your own repurposing with existing trade rules.
1 more minute.
Yeah. I think that if you look about actual country experience that try to do repurposing, and because we do it at IFPRI, and when you work with them, they say, oh, but WTO forbids me to do that. That's not even 1% of the type of question or point we have. So we can already do a lot at the country level, but not really maybe in a coordinated way. What I just want to point is some measure that people can criticize, let's say blue box. When you apply them to the livestock sector in developed economy, it's a pretty nice instrument, because limiting production of livestock product in the north is going to be part of fighting climate change, is going to be part of being on the methane agreement of COP26. So, how we try to reduce production in some place while still supporting income, we already some have boxes that can make sense. Green box, I think it's where we are going to face some issue, because a lot of this repurposing can go for green box, but it can be just a blank check for a lot of bad behavior, as we have seen in the past. Some of the box 16 we have seen by clever policymaker, sometimes is nice from a legal point of view, but in terms of delivering for the key missions, it is a bit weaker. Changing how we measure price support by relying on historical prices, of course, is a big problem. I mean, both in terms of development, in terms of logic. So I think here the WTO can as a problem and may want to think about it. But the next big milestone is what WTO members want the WTO to do. Is it just about do no harm institution? And now we have to think that, yes, and I think it's very clear, a do no harm in the space of trade and of trade distorting is not synonymous than a do no harm in the space of health, environment, and I would say even poverty reduction. There is no synonymous yet. Sometimes they overlap and everyone is happy. Sometimes they do not, and people may start to disagree. But really this question about what the WTO should take care of, only trade? And is it a do no harm or actually trying to do good in trade and beyond? that's really a big step. But it has to come from a political consensus, and we have to be careful about that. In any case, that should be combined with transparency. People need to understand what is happening. We should not start to panic when people move their things, even if we use still boxes. When they see people spending more in green box program, we have to be sure that it's not hurting their own farmers, and there is actually some kind of global solidarity, in terms of public good. It has been said before, intellectual property rights is important, including, in terms of agricultural technology. And that's something we should really be careful about. Now, using border protection.
It, David. I've got to stop you now.
I'm concluding.
Okay.
Border protection, in order to compensate for the fact that your neighbor is not implementing a green policy enough, that's more a threat. If countries start to implement them, I think we are going to be in trouble. And my last point is we have to think about global markets when we think about agriculture, not regional markets, for a very simple reason. We live on one planet that have one climate, but with very localized effects. So if you have a drought in southern part of Africa, you need to be able to bring food either from Ukraine or from Brazil. We have two hemispheres on this planet. That's something we are very lucky in terms of cropping season and things like this. And with climate change, even if we mitigate the impact, weather extreme events are going to increase. And so the capacity for the food system to be resilient is going to be based about how we can change planting decision over the world, how we can take advantage that this year we have too much water in one place, not enough in the other. And that's where I think we should not forget, and why the WTO will still be relevant, even if we have some rules to change. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you for ending on what I think is now a disagreement. So I hope that we can have more debate or dialogue here with Michael's point about needing to move to more territorial, local, regional, national markets. And David saying in the current world and with climate change, we're going to need to keep it global, even though it's created a lot of the problems that we see today. David, thank you. That was an incredibly rich discussion. I think you mentioned quite a bit transparency. First, we need to be transparent about what we're talking about, and not everyone is measuring the same things. And that's really key when we look at these numbers, that we are going to need to repurpose rather than eliminate, but the current spending we have is not going to be enough to deal with all of the health, nutrition, and climate challenges that we face. And we need to be honest about the fact that just repurposing existing spending is not going to magically solve all the problems that we're trying to solve today. And that the WTO, I think you clearly said, David, the WTO still does have a place, but we have to think about what place it is. And is it do no harm to trade, or is it trying to be about do no harm to bigger things? Can it be a do good place? Some of the boxes may have some interesting principles, others may not. But is this still a place? So Sophia, you've spent your entire life thinking about the WTO and its role in helping achieve food security and managing agricultural markets. So please share with us your thoughts on all of this. And sorry, just to acknowledge, Eddie, I saw a comment from Bobby and Jorge. As soon as Sophia's finished, I'll give you guys the floor. Sophia.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and also mildly depressing to think that I spent my whole life doing this. But it's true, it's been a lot of years, and I have a lot more gray hair than I did when I started. So to try and go through quickly, because I'm looking forward to the conversation that we have time for after. First, in terms of the report, when I first saw it, I had quite mixed feelings, and Michael has expressed some of them. A certain amount of here we go again, chasing a unicorn of perfect markets that ignores concentrated market power on behalf of the transnational companies that are basically choke points in the food system, and acting as if it's only producer policies and consumer policies that matter, and chasing billions of dollars as if they were actual spending, as opposed to money that might exist were we to have a perfect market and were there to be such a thing as a government-free market. I'm stylizing because I know the report itself is much more sophisticated than that, but that it's hard. I think it continues to perpetuate certain, what I would call myths. At the same time, I was also really happy. It's finally a clear call for transformation. It's coming from all sides now, and not just from a few, specialized agencies or civil society organizations, heavyweights in the UN system intervening in a discussion where we need far more expertise than trade negotiators alone can bring, and really giving some space to a conversation about how the public is using its money and what it wants from that. And if I think about it from IATP, the organization where I work, we kind of have two big goals. One is to reduce the harm agriculture does, reduce the harm that our lack of regulation in some cases and misplaced spending allow agriculture to perpetuate, and at the same time increase our investment in agroecological food systems, which for us start with a kind of democratic principle about who is defining what the food system will be, what we eat, and how is that negotiated, if you like, as a social contract between societies. And I think that the reason the WTO matters to me is because that conversation can't just be a national conversation. Food systems are not bounded by national borders created by a series of historic events that have had often little to do with soil and water and food. And so you see, even now, many food systems depend on cross-border exchange, not just because of, the ports of Rotterdam and New Orleans, but also because historically, civilizations have ignored colonial borders, for example, and continue to trade across the boundaries that, newcomers try to impose. So just now drawing a little bit, I just have come out of a long period of academic work where I was looking at the World Trade Organization Agreement on Agriculture and using the food price crisis of 2007, 2008 as a bit of a watershed to compare how food security and our understanding of what we needed from our food systems evolved and enriched enormously in these last 25 years, and how the static nature of the trade rules has created an increasingly anachronistic piece of our regulatory system, and that needs to be updated. And a lot of what I might say is, it's partly been captured by Michael, I think. There were real problems in the 1980s. It was also an important, but maybe unusual moment of agreement on what had to happen in a concerted way to stop specific kinds of harm created by unmanaged oversupply in international markets. And as David pointed out, there were some limited successes around those objectives. And as Michael pointed out, never really a fulfillment of the agreement between North and South, broadly written, on what would be received and given out of the Uruguay round in terms of agriculture. And what was established, and I think it's important to understand this, domestic support epitomizes inequality for a lot of WTO members. It is the archetype example of why the rules aren't fair, why they were cheated, why the rich countries don't mean what they say. And the truth of that is one thing, but the myth of that is really something powerful. And having spent a lot of time talking to delegates over these 25 years, the myth persists. The cast changes, but this idea persists. And of course, the refusal of rich countries to acknowledge their privilege and to do something about the damage also persists. And that's happened even as there are newer rich countries, and those new rich countries are also spending billions of dollars or equivalent on their agriculture. It doesn't change the underlying sense of feeling cheated, which makes it a very difficult space for trade agreements to thrive. We've also, and David pointed this out, we've changed where food is grown. We've changed who controls supplies. We don't have the same, few large exporters with large publicly controlled stocks. That problem is gone. So we've seen a big increase in volatility in international markets. We've seen big shifts in what the environment will bear. We're starting to pay the price much more seriously now for the climate change that's put in place, for the water that's being depleted, for the poor care of soil, for the continuing deforestation as new land is brought into production. But the environment's not the only dynamic. We've also seen big changes in how commodity markets work, in what technology allows us to do, the speed at which prices are changing and shifted, the way in which contracts are arrived at, the investment agreements that changed how capital is controlled. All of that has also dramatically changed the environment in which the international market operates and has increased the sources of volatility And in many ways, we're still struggling to catch up with that. Governments don't yet fully understand, I think, the power of the information and communications technology that we have at our disposal. And so there's a lot of running catch up going on. And at the WTO, meanwhile, at the Agreement on Agriculture, we don't even know how to cope with inflation. We don't even have agreement on how to measure support that acknowledges currency fluctuations and inflation, and how that should somehow be brought in. We have incoherence in different parts of the Agreement on Agriculture, and a refusal politically to deal with what that implies for countries, just to get the transparency that David's talking about and to understand what it is we're counting, and then what we want to do with that. So finally, I think, keeping an eye on this time, I would say that before I do want to come to something about what next. So the final point about the instability we're facing is also political. That as we have shifted from a predominantly domestic debate about what food policy should be to one that is also importantly, certainly not entirely, but importantly also located in trade, we've diminished the transparency at home, and we've changed the opportunities and the cast of those who have a voice in how the agricultural policy is determined. And that was the protest from the get-go in the 1980s in the streets of Brussels and Montreal. And that continues to be an enormous problem, that trade negotiations, if anything, have gotten more secretive, and they certainly have done nothing to bring in more people. And so that means that, especially among the powerful countries, there are a few countries more viscerally opposed to the WTO as an idea than you'll find in the United States or in India. These are countries with huge, massive public resistance to the idea of global trade rules. And I think it's a problem for everyone, and that the lack of the sort of democratic deficit around who decides what trade policy should be is an important part of that resistance. So to come to my final list, which was a bit of a scroll and a little bit taken from what we've been hearing from other speakers as well. So to say this idea of transparency is huge, completely support what David said about it. To say it also, we need transparency at the WTO about the objectives of the ag policy. There's a lot of posturing about free trade and a lot of posturing about how exports will help everybody. And there's very little evidence that any government there actually believes that, and that any government there is really operating its food system believing that that is what it's about. So some transparency about what the objectives are. And David is providing that list. These reports provide a list of what countries are grappling with, and we're all grappling with it. And I think that's where we need this. I don't know if it's food agreements, like Michael's saying. It's definitely other centers of discussion and debate about what food systems should look like to help the WTO. Of course, you can't fix it all, solve it all in a trade discussion, but there are no parameters there. We have a very weak and inadequate discussion of agriculture at the Climate Change Convention. We have more discussion in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but still a lot of kind of ecological emphasis on the trade-offs and not enough understanding of food security there, and no understanding of private market power. Lacking at the WTO, lacking in these discussions about carbon markets, entirely missing from the net zero pledges that we hear coming out. So
2 minutes, Sophia.
2 minutes. Okay, so I'll say, like, what next? First, deal with the oligopolies. Let's put them on the table, talk about it. What does it mean to produce for an international market if that market is not competitive for reasons that are not to do with the state? Second, deal with these things like the currency and inflation, and underlying it all, focus on outcomes. Don't focus on intent. Don't try and second guess what the negotiating partner is really trying to do, but understand what the outcome will be. And what Brazil does matters much more than what Norway does. Even as David will tell me, many Norways add up to a Brazil. But I mean, your market impact is what matters at the WTO, and that ought to be relevant. Much more relevant than your development status, so-called. Create room for more technical exchange. What's working? What are you experimenting with? What's going on? What kinds of transition payments for farmers are meeting with success? How are you managing your supply? And this problem of the agriculture faces, where supply is often destabilizing the market because we're too successful. And then, I think I'll leave it there to say only lastly that I think the regional and plurilaterals reinforce a lot of inequality. And I don't disagree about the importance of territorial markets, but I definitely disagree that it can be solved regionally. I'm sympathetic to David's point that most food markets aren't set that way and the transition would be tricky, but also that a lot of smaller developing countries, their inequality is magnified when you go to a regional discussion. If you think about who is outside of that Trans-Pacific Partnership and how dependent many small countries are on members of that Trans-Pacific Partnership, where they had no say in what those rules were and how they were determined, I think that the idea of one country, one vote, however difficult it is in practice, is not unimportant, and for me remains an important piece of the idea of the WTO. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Sophia, for those very thoughtful comments. I mean, just a few things, the myths, keeping on perpetuating the myths, whether it's in our research, whether it's in the discourse that keeps happening, but trying to move beyond those myths and really unpack what we're talking about and get closer to what's actually going on. Leading to a big point that's come through from a number of speakers, but particularly strongly from Sophia, about transparency, and not just about transparency of information and data, about transparency of what objectives people are trying to achieve through these trade rules, through the trading system, through their agricultural support. Yeah, and then thank you for those. I mean, I think all of you came up with like quite great plans for the future. Sophia's points were about dealing with the oligopolies, dealing with currency and inflation, focusing on outcomes rather than intent to try and break some of the tense negotiating dynamics that we see, and leaving room for exchange. So we have a number of questions that have come up in the chat box. There was a question above from Bobby that I think was one of our first questions, so I don't want to ignore that, from Bobby Matheson, about if the WTO were to look at sustainability, it would need to look at the level of nutrition of various products and not inadvertently create border sustainable diet issues, especially in LDCs. So I think this was more of a comment than a question. And then I'm going to let Eddie take the floor first, then Jorge and Jeff, and then if Bettina wants to, Bettina's got a question for David. So David, I invite you to have a look in the chat box to the question from Bettina. And then there's a question from all. So Bettina, if you want to speak, I'll also give you the floor, but let's start with Eddie. You have the floor. Please just ask a question if possible, because we've only got 15 minutes.
Yep, I'll ask a question. My name's Eddie Wax. I'm a reporter for Politico Europe based in Brussels. I wanted to ask a question to Michael IFPRI and then one to David. But if there's no time, I'll only keep one for Michael.
Go for it. Go for it. You can ask the two.
My questions to Michael are, what impact is European farm policy having on the right to food worldwide? And you mentioned the hypocrisy of the EU and the US when it comes to the TRIPS waiver, or the TRIPS issue at the WTO. And can you just explain what you mean by that? What's the relationship between TRIPS and food, and why is the EU and the US being hypocritical? And yeah, so the quick question to David was, do you think that the EU's reformed farm policy starting in 2023 is a good example of repurposing agricultural support, or are there problems with it? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. Jorge.
Thank you very much. I am coming from the underground here because my experience was based in WTO. So I hope that you are going to forgive me for what I'm going to say. I am going to make a couple of questions. One was answered in practice because I was to ask why there is no representative of WTO here. But perhaps you have good motives to make this as a church more than a discussion. This is a political election. My question is, people which are discussing the subsidies should know, and I suppose they know, and I am asking if they know, the subsidies have permitted to create intensive practices in agriculture. And intensive practices in agriculture means pesticides, plaguicides, and the destroying of fresh water and the land with the same stone. So this is the kind of subsidies or reforms that you are proposing. Because I didn't have the grasp of knowing exactly what do you want and how do you want to transform subsidies and to create more subsidies for what? To repeat the European experience. Well, I'm not going to, and I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Jorge.
I'm sorry, just one
yes.
thing. My granddaughter is called Sophia as well, and I would be more than happy to explain to Sophia many of the questions that you are asking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. And we actually had invited 3 of the ambassadors in Geneva who are ambassadors to the WTO, but because of the ministerial conference, they declined, even though that has been cancelled. Jeff, over to you for questions.
Yeah, several. Thank you very much. You mentioned...
And just a quick intro, if you can, Jeff.
So who I am?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean,
Jeff
I know
Tansey,
you, but...
yeah, I worked for many years on food and agriculture issues. I spent 10 years working with negotiators at the WTO on Article 27.3b and other things, as well as running an open education online resource called the Food Systems Academy. I'll put some links in the thing afterwards. Several points. You talked about countries being major exporters, but who controls the seeds? And how important, as Sophia was talking about, do we have to look at the role of the private sector now? And we've got an increasingly oligopolistic structure. TRIPS is a major issue because it's facilitated the consolidation of the seed industry, and throughout we've seen it. Phil Howard's work, we've now just got 3 major companies around the world. So I think there's a role of IP which is influencing access to knowledge and change in the direction of R&D, and is skewing that. So there's an issue around that. The second thing, I think David talked about subsidies to show the poor could have carrots. No, the issue is, how do you make the poor richer? So they don't need subsidies to require this. And this is a whole issue around the way we talk about food and poverty. Thirdly, issues around, you'd mentioned in climate change, we're going to have bad harvests in different parts of the world. One of the challenges which we never met after the World Food Conference in 1974 was to have distributed food stocks around the world. It's no good having food stocks right across the world in another part if you've got a major famine and you can't get them there in time. So there's an issue about the physicality of having food stocks and the resistance from traders to having those because it depresses prices. So there's an issue around the commodity trading rules and food stocks, I think. So those are kind of 3 kind of big points I wanted to put up. And the other thing is, we talk as if farmers grow food. Farmers make a living from the land, and they can grow food, feed, fibre, fuel or energy. So it's that bigger framework and determines whether or not farmers are going to use the skills and the knowledge to grow food in that land as well. So another element I think we need to reflect on. Thank you.
Karen, you're
muted.
Sorry. Lastly, over to Bettina to ask questions, and then we will pass back to our speakers. Thanks. And Jorge, can I ask you if you could mute again your microphone, please? Bettina.
Yes, thank you very much. Good evening from Berlin. I'm Bettina Rudloff, working at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, which is advising the German and as well the European Parliament. And I'm agricultural economist there. And I have a question to David and maybe a small observation I did with colleagues working on other sectors. So on David, regarding the question on how to enforce certain sustainability standards at the border, do you think there could be a kind of, how to say, consensus finding model which could be comparable to the Codex Alimentarius, which is completely different because it's legally covered by the SPS agreement, that's clear, but more in a mentally sense, trying to build a kind of Codex sustainability in order to build up a consensus internationally, multilateral, starting with the most accepted standards. I'm thinking about, yeah, in the end, coming up with multilateral standards, of course, which then in a next step you could impose at the border. Alternatively, one needs kind of footprint exercises for some standards to be reallocated, let's say, to the product as such. So my question would be, do you think that could be an idea to develop this kind of logical model as a guiding principle, a codex sustainability? And the observation I would like to share is in other sectors, I mean, there are a lot of problems and difficulties here on agricultural subsidies. However, experts in other sectors, they are kind of jealous that at least we have something in our sector. They don't have that at all. They're starting now some exercises on metals, for instance, to use the PSE and CSE concept, which is not identical with the WTO classification, of course, but they have been historically developed a bit of in parallel, which is interesting. And my just naive thinking could be trying to build a broader coalition. So trying, if they now enter this area to classify their subsidies and use our model, which is not perfect, could one try to build up a bigger coalition across sectors, saying, okay, let's think about in all type of sectors of a better system? That's something I just wanted to share with you. And I added an interesting article about that issue in the show.
Thank you, Bettina. Okay, so we are probably going to go a few minutes over time because we're 5 minutes to the end. So for those who have to leave, thank you for having joined us, but I will take 5 minutes more to let our speakers answer. Michael, I might start with you. You got quite a few questions raised to you, so I'll start with you. And then I'll move to David and then Valentino and Sophia with the last word. So Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, everyone. This is really an exciting conversation. So I think I'll take a general point that I've heard amongst different people and different speakers, which is how do we build a new multilateral consensus? And I think we can't separate that question from the institutional question, which is where should we be having this conversation? Maybe the WTO, probably not. UNCTAD with new leadership might be a place to build that consensus. And we can think about, again, institutional design. It could be a lot more creative. We can have UNCTAD, WTO, maybe some sort of souped up CFS. That dynamic needs to open up because the WTO, as David said, thinks about do no harm very much in trade terms, and we're at a deadlock. Now to the more specific questions, another point on consensus, you know, something we've danced around here and people dance around in other forums is, well, what's the problem? And, you know, we should often start with that. Sophia pointed to, I think, what I agree with, which is a big problem is the concentration of power. And we should often start the conversation with questions of power and politics, then get to policy, economics, law, that sort of thing. And we can't separate those. We can't say, well, look, we came up with a clever idea and now let's just figure out the politics of it. Those two always go in hand. And I see this conversation is a lot more robust in that regard in a good way. How does the EU food policy undermine the right to food? The shortest version I can give is it breaks that deal I talked about, which is it subsidizes European farmers in a way that doesn't necessarily help European people or people living in the EU rather. And it keeps the power in the hands of the EU in terms of, then it does these bilateral agreements and regional agreements, and it just doesn't allow the import of goods into the EU. That original deal of the 80s, which is we'll open up our markets, says the EU and the US, and you can send it our way. So it's an economic, but on the right to food question, I don't have the time to go into the complaint because right to food captures health, environment, biodiversity, power, all of that. So I just don't have that time right now. The hypocrisy of TRIPS, it's twofold. One, it's that idea, again, like I mentioned, of the EU and the US and richer countries at the time saying, we want to expand intellectual property rights into the global south. And what we'll do, global south, is we'll open up our markets so you can sell to us. And they didn't do that. But then to Jeff's point, TRIPS is also problematic is in that it complicates the question of who has power over seeds. So I'll just leave it at that. And then Jorge's question exactly is subsidies for what? Bettina's point of building multilateral consensus again, I think that's an institutional question. This is what I want to end on quickly. I want to clarify, of course we live on one planet, and of course multilateralism is ideal. That's why the G33 won't let go of the WTO despite consistent losses. They can build that coalition there. However, it can't, notice how we were talking, regional trade agreements as they are now. The TPP is just neoliberalism on steroids. That's why it reproduces inequality. What I'm talking about is, and maybe I shouldn't use the language of plurilateralism because that now has new baggage. What I'm talking about is a complexity of different types of agreements that are capturing different ecological territories, that they're going to be overlap. Some are going to focus on a particular food item. Some are going to be very political alliances, so based on solidarity. So to David's point, yes, if there's a drought here and someone needs to help someone else, et cetera, but multilateralism on a global market vision doesn't work. That reproduces inequality. But if you have strong solidarity amongst like-minded countries that create an agreement, a territorial agreement, that they can share with each other. Some are in the Northern Hemisphere, some are in the Southern Hemisphere. You have seasonal tariffs to anticipate things. And then the multilateral challenge will be, how do we coordinate all the different complexities at play? That's the challenge I'm putting forward to everyone, so that we don't reproduce inequalities. And then that we have new processes, that we have the farmers, the fishers, the pastoralists in the negotiation design from the beginning. That would be sort of the idea. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. David.
Yes, quickly. I really want to emphasize two aspects. First, the role of competition. It has been said by other players, but I really want to say it's important. For me, there is not so much sense to discuss trade without thinking about competition and actually investment at one point. And that was in the initial mandate of UNCTAD. For various reasons, this has not worked. And we are a bit in a mess now, but I think making progress on trade is great. But yes, competition is key. In any country, people are very clear about this. You have a competition agency, because otherwise you are not going to let the market lead to a few monopolies that will extract the gain from the consumer on one hand and will capture the subsidies on the other hand from the government. So that we should not shy away from this discussion. Sustainability and the type of a Codex 2.0 about consensus about what is good. I will say yes, with just maybe some caveats, meaning that I think we need to get consensus on that. And if government doesn't find consensus, the private sector will find consensus for everyone and will enforce it. That's what we see with a lot of private labels too. So getting government still in control, representing both economic but non-economic interest, I think is important. Now, a product or even some technology are not something bad everywhere, depending on what soil you are dealing with, what type of crops you are dealing with, what type of rainfall pattern you are dealing with. Some type of fertilizer can be quite good and apply in another context, it's not. And that, I think, is one of the key messages here. Being a farmer is difficult, it's challenging, it's stressful, both for the small one and the big one. But when you are the small one, your livelihood can be really impacted by something bad. And thinking that also policymakers can do the right choice or pick the right technology, or even, and I will be maybe in a bit of disagreement with Michael here, start to play with tariffs from one month to another to start to stabilize things, doesn't work, has never worked. Most policymakers doesn't really understand what's happening on farm. And we really want to get a very good environment for letting farmers and consumers making the right choice, and not trying to get the policy making choice for them, because that's a big issue I have seen, once again, following a detailed applied policy. What we have seen with the EU now and the EU reform, so on the paper, it goes in the right direction. We ask new questions. We already start to think that, it's farm to fork, but actually, we cannot really, with the farm policies, with the CAP, change what consumers want. So the consumer part has been put on the side, but when you think nutrition and health, you need to think about how you educate your consumer. Now, what we have seen, it's very difficult to change things. The changes have not been so drastic. And in particular, now we are going to let member states in the EU take a number of decisions. And that, for me, is a test of truth, You give a bit more freedom to government and you will see what they will do with the money. And unfortunately, in the past, we have not always seen enlightened behavior when you try to decentralize and let people do what they want, because the role of capture of some of the regulatory or government can be quite big as a small. So let's see. I mean, good intention, good, but more freedom at the country level versus more coordination at the upper level of governance. I think that you need coordination, and sometimes you need to take the big picture. My last point will be about the carbon issue, because I think it's important. What we are arguing right now is because no government has been able to properly tax and value carbon. So instead of addressing the carbon issue, say, oh, can now we give money for farmers to do a bit more on capturing GHG or things like that? Okay, but we are really at the second best or third best. If we had leveled the playing field on carbon, we will not be about this end of the pipe, tricky adjustment of stuff. And for farmers, that's going to be a major question, because as it has been said in discussion, farmers are using land. And during basically maybe 30,000 years of civilization and governments at different stage, no one has put a carbon value on this land. And if tomorrow we really ask the question, do we want a forest that capture carbon? Do we want agricultural practices that sink carbon in soil? Or just, the value of land is the value of the production and we don't care about carbon? That's a very different world we operate in. And the transition will not be easy. And so far, we were talking about something that no one is really paying for. And that will be a big change, and on which the policy pathway and the political pathway and the political economy, I think that Michael is very right. And, you can say whatever you want, you can have the best ideas. If you don't have the institution to carry it and the process to make it happen, that sometimes a recipe for disaster, or at least a statu quo that will not address the challenge. Thank you very much. And thanks for the question. I know I cannot address all the details, but I will try to follow up also.
Thanks, David. Valentina, over to you.
Karin, thanks. For the sake of time, we can move on. Maybe Sophia has something to say. My closing points were just to corroborate some of the interesting insights that were raised by colleague around the need for institutional reinforcement. And I really appreciate this sort of challenge of the proposed challenge of trying to change the language. Is not to excuse ourselves, but I think that we use the old-fashioned way because that's the only language that we have available right now. And so we needed to communicate concepts. So maybe this is the way, this is a starting point to start framing these issues in a different way. So this is it from my side.
Great, thanks, Valentina. I think it's a really important point you've just raised. Sophia, over to you, and then I will close.
Also really quickly, and thanks everyone, there's just a lot going on and a lot more to say. Maybe just to say on the sort of whole issue of private power, and also this idea of whether or not we've got the measures we need in agriculture and we can use them in other sectors, just to say that if we don't see the private market power, if we don't understand how the subsidies are interacting there, and as David said, to be thinking about competition, then we're not doing anyone a favor. So we definitely have to recognize the problem and then start to think about how to capture it. And it'll mean a big rethink, I think, of what competition policy means. We can use what we've got better. We also will need new norms and new understanding of, it's a privilege to trade. What are your responsibilities if you engage in international trade? And then to say, it's far from perfect maybe, but it is a starting point. One, we have rules now in place, enforced, that govern domestic support at the WTO. We need to do something about it. I still stay kind of stuck there with the fact that we've got a problem that we could maybe think about solving more effectively. And also that the WTO, in fairness, is the only place that has taken on countries' extraterritorial responsibility for how their domestic agriculture choices affect others. We have, and we should exercise our evolved ideas of sovereignty abroad, not just at home. And so we've got to really think that through. I think the human rights machinery gives us a huge amount to work with there, understanding our responsibilities to one another, underlining Michael's point about solidarity. We are going to need some norms and ideals as well as some hard pragmatism to get us through. But I think it's worth recognizing that the WTO at least establishes a conversation, and it's not an easy one, but it's one we need to have, that what we decide to do in our region has implications around the world. Somewhere we have to take responsibility for that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Valentina, Michael, David, and Sophia. This has been an incredibly rich debate. Thank you for everyone who've put your comments, who've asked your questions. Thank you for joining so in such big numbers. I can't summarize the richness of this debate, but we will follow up with a report and a summary of what we've discussed about. But I think that there is very clear messaging coming from all of you today about the need to develop this new discussion, to talk about this now, to talk about this in a different way, to break some of the previous myths or the previous language or the previous ways we were talking about these problems, and to find ways to talk about them differently that, as you say, Michael, doesn't just focus on policy solutions or legal solutions, but looks at power and politics and how those need to come into the discussions about what we need to do to change our system. I think all of you have said that the institutional side of this is key. It's not just about what we talk about, it's about where we talk about it and who has power. And there have been divergent views between you about whether this should be in the WTO or outside. It sounds like it needs to be both inside and out. The WTO can't tackle this entire agenda. So there needs to be able to be space outside the WTO to talk about these issues, whether that's at UNCTAD or the CFS or at the UN Human Rights Council. We have to allow other voices who are affected by these policies and other issues that are affected by these policies to be able to discuss it and come up with solutions, whether they are rules-based or voluntary, as in the case of the CFS. So I think that is another big message that I think has to come through going forward. It's not about one or the other, but about opening that space for having those hard conversations. And Michael, you are one of the big champions of that. You have your first report as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was on trade. So I think you are trying to make that happen in the human rights spaces, but UNEP, UNDP, and FAO are trying to have that happening in the environmental, the development, and the food space. So I think this is happening, and this is really, really welcome. But that I think there's another reality that this issue of subsidies and support to producers is a very narrow piece of the puzzle. I mean, David talked about needing to look at consumers as well. Sophia focused a lot about needing to look at markets and who has power in markets, and particularly private markets. And I think unless we broaden this debate beyond just agriculture and food to, as you guys were saying, competition and investment and trade, I think we don't find the solutions either. And again, that cannot happen only in the WTO. It has to happen outside as well. So thank you for your contributions. Thank you to everyone who's participated. We look forward to maybe seeing some of you in person in Geneva when the ministerial does happen next year, to continue this discussion and to continue this debate. And I hope you enjoy the rest of our Trade and Sustainability Hub, which has its last day tomorrow. But thank you again for everyone, and look forward to continuing this discussion.